The gunshot echoed through Bitter Creek, Wyoming, and Ruby Lawson flinched as if the bullet had struck her instead of the saloon sign above. She clutched her worn satchel tighter to her chest, head bowed beneath the weight of whispers that followed her like vultures. It was 1879, and the frontier town had already decided her worth before she'd set foot on its dusty Main Street. Ruby tucked a strand of copper hair behind her ear and straightened her spine. 23 years of life had taught her that dignity was sometimes all a woman had left. The stagecoach that had deposited her here 3 days ago might as well have dropped her in hell itself. There she goes again, a woman's voice carried across the street. The one from that house in Cheyenne. Ruby kept walking, her boots leaving shallow imprints in the mud. She'd survived worse than gossip. The scar on her left temple was proof enough of that. Her green eyes remained fixed on the modest boarding house at the end of the street, her temporary sanctuary, until she could earn enough for a place of her own. Mrs. Hatcher, the boarding house owner, had taken pity on Ruby when no one else would. "I don't care about your past, girl," the older woman had said. "Just pay your rent on time and keep to yourself." Ruby had nearly wept with gratitude. The only work she'd found was washing dishes at Thornton's Cafe, where the owner kept her hidden in the back like a shameful secret. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, something Ruby craved more than anything. She was nearly at the boarding house steps when a commotion down the street caught her attention. A group of cowboys had ridden in, trail dust coating their clothes and horses. Their boisterous laughter carried on the wind, carefree and foreign to Ruby's ears. One rider broke away from the pack, leading his chestnut stallion toward the general store. Even from a distance, Ruby could tell he carried himself differently than the others. There was a quiet confidence in his posture, a gentleness in how he handled his horse. "Miss Lawson." Mrs. Hatcher called from the porch. "There's a letter for you." Ruby hurried up the steps, grateful for the distraction. "Thank you, Mrs. Hatcher. You look pale, dear. Are you eating enough?" Ruby managed a small smile. "Yes, madam, just tired is all." Inside her sparse room, Ruby sat on the edge of her narrow bed and opened the letter with trembling fingers. It was from Maggie, the only friend she'd made at Madame Bouchard's. The familiar handwriting brought both comfort and pain. "Dearest Ruby," it began. "I pray this finds you well and building the new life you deserve." Tears blurred Ruby's vision as she read about Maggie's escape to San Francisco, where she'd found work as a seamstress. "They don't ask questions here," Maggie wrote. "People can starting fresh." Ruby traced the words with her fingertip. That's what she'd come to Bitter Creek to do, but the town seemed determined to keep her past alive. A knock at her door startled her. Ruby quickly wiped her eyes and tucked the letter under her pillow. "Miss Lawson." Mrs. Hatcher's voice was hesitant. "Mr. Thornton sent word he won't be needing you tomorrow, says business is slow." Ruby's heart sank. "That meant no pay for tomorrow. Thank you for telling me. I might need help with laundry if you're interested. Can't pay much, but—" "I'd be grateful," Ruby said quickly. "Thank you." After Mrs. Hatcher's footsteps faded, Ruby moved to the small window overlooking the street. The cowboys were still visible, gathering at the saloon now. The man with the chestnut horse stood apart, speaking with the blacksmith. Something about him drew her eye, perhaps the way he removed his hat respectfully while conversing, or how he stood straight but not rigid. Ruby turned away. Men like that weren't for women like her. She'd learned that lesson painfully well. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Ruby rose early to help Mrs. Hatcher with the mountain of laundry. Her hands reddened and cracked in the harsh lye soap, but she welcomed the work. Physical pain was preferable to the endless churning of her thoughts. "You have a deft hand with the linens," Mrs. Hatcher commented, watching Ruby expertly fold a sheet. "Where did you learn to do laundry so well?" Ruby tensed. My mother taught me, before she passed. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her mother had taught her many things before consumption took her when Ruby was 12. The rest, the careful, methodical ways of caring for fine fabrics, she'd learned at Madame Bouchard's, where the linens were changed daily and had to be immaculate. "Well, your mother taught you right," Mrs. Hatcher said. "I appreciate the help." By midday, they'd hung the last of the washing on the line. Ruby wiped sweat from her brow, watching the sheets billow like sails in the warm breeze. "Why don't you take these biscuits to the general store and trade them for some coffee?" Mrs. Hatcher handed Ruby a cloth-wrapped package. "We're nearly out, and Mr. Peterson always had a weakness for my baking." Ruby hesitated. The general store meant facing more of the town's scorn, but she couldn't refuse after Mrs. Hatcher's kindness. "Of course." The bell above the door jingled as Ruby entered Peterson's general store. The cool interior was a welcome relief from the summer heat. Mr. Peterson was helping another customer, so Ruby quietly moved to the coffee barrels, hoping to remain unnoticed. "I hear Barton's planning to bring in more cattle next month," a deep voice said from the next aisle. "Might need extra hands. You looking for work, Mr. Caldwell?" Peterson replied, "Thought you were passing through. Plans change." Ruby reached for the scoop, accidentally knocking it against the barrel. The clatter drew the attention of both men. "Can I help you, miss?" Mr. Peterson's tone cooled noticeably when he recognized her. Ruby straightened her shoulders. "Mrs. Hatcher sent me to trade these biscuits for some coffee." She placed the package on the counter. Peterson eyed it suspiciously. "Mrs. Hatcher's biscuits, you say?" "Yes, sir. Fresh baked this morning." The man beside Peterson turned to look at her, and Ruby found herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. They were startling against his sun-darkened skin, crinkled slightly at the corners, as if he smiled often. "Mrs. Hatcher's biscuits are worth their weight in gold," the man said, his voice warm and rich like honey. "I had some when I passed through last year, nearly proposed marriage on the spot." A reluctant smile tugged at Ruby's lips. Peterson huffed. "That'll be half a pound of coffee, then." "No more." "Seems fair to me," the stranger said, still watching Ruby with curious eyes. Ruby busied herself with examining a shelf of canned goods while Peterson measured out the coffee. She could feel the stranger's gaze on her back but refused to turn around. "Miss." Peterson's voice was clipped. "Your coffee. Thank you." Ruby took the small package and headed for the door. "Madam," the stranger called after her. "You dropped this." Ruby turned to see him holding out her handkerchief. She hadn't even realized she'd taken it out. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, Flint Caldwell." He tipped his hat. "New in town, relatively." Ruby took the handkerchief, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Good day, Mr. Caldwell." She felt his eyes on her all the way back to the boarding house. That evening, Ruby sat on the back porch shelling peas for dinner. The repetitive task soothed her, and the fading light provided a brief respite from the day's heat. From here, she could see the edge of town where it gave way to vast open prairie. Sometimes she imagined just walking into that emptiness, disappearing like morning mist. "Evening, miss." Ruby startled, peas scattering across her apron. Flint Caldwell stood at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in hand. His chestnut horse was tethered to the fence post nearby. "Mr. Caldwell," she acknowledged, gathering the escaped peas. "Can I help you?" "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Hatcher about a room. Peterson mentioned she keeps the cleanest boarding house in 3 counties. Ruby nodded cautiously. "She does. She's inside preparing dinner." Flint climbed the first step, then paused. "I didn't catch your name earlier." "Ruby Lawson. Pretty name." His smile was gentle, lacking the predatory edge Ruby had grown wary of in men's expressions. "Do you work here for Mrs. Hatcher? I help out where I can." Ruby resumed her shelling, needing something to do with her hands. "She's been kind to me." Flint seemed about to say more when the screen door creaked open. "Well now, who's this?" Mrs. Hatcher emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Flint Caldwell, madam." He removed his hat. "I'm looking for lodging. Mr. Peterson suggested your establishment." Mrs. Hatcher beamed. "Did he now? Well, come on in, Mr. Caldwell. I've got one room available if you don't mind it being small." "Small suits me fine, madam." As they disappeared inside, Ruby released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The last thing she needed was this man's attention, however harmless it seemed. Men's interest always came with a price, and Ruby had paid that price too many times already. She finished with the peas and brought them inside, slipping through the kitchen to avoid the front parlor where Mrs. Hatcher's voice mingled with Flint's deeper tones. In her room, Ruby sat at her small mirror and unbraided her hair, examining her reflection critically. At 23, her face still held the softness of youth, but her eyes told a different story. They'd seen too much, trusted too easily, and paid dearly for it. Ruby ran her fingers over the small scar at her temple, a souvenir from the night she'd finally gathered the courage to flee Madame Bouchard's after 3 years of captivity. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Ruby, dinner's ready," Mrs. Hatcher called. "And we have a new boarder joining us." Ruby closed her eyes briefly. "I'll be right down." The dining room table was set for 3. Mrs. Hatcher bustled about, bringing out a steaming pot of stew that filled the room with savory aromas. Flint stood when Ruby entered, a gesture of respect she wasn't accustomed to receiving. "Miss Lawson," he nodded. "Mr. Caldwell will be staying with us for a while," Mrs. Hatcher explained. "He's looking for ranch work." "I've done a bit of everything," Flint said, waiting for both women to be seated before taking his own chair. "Drove cattle up from Texas, did some scouting for the Army, even panned for gold once. That didn't pan out." His eyes twinkled at his own joke. Despite herself, Ruby smiled. "And what brings you to our little Bitter Creek?" Mrs. Hatcher asked, serving the stew. "Change of scenery. Got tired of Texas heat." Flint accepted his bowl with thanks. "Heard Wyoming's got opportunity for a man willing to work hard." "That it does," Mrs. Hatcher agreed. "Though opportunities for women are somewhat scarcer." She glanced meaningfully at Ruby. Flint's gaze followed. "What kind of work do you do, Miss Lawson? When you're not helping Mrs. Hatcher, that is." Ruby tensed. "I wash dishes at Thornton's Cafe when he needs me." "Ruby's quite talented," Mrs. Hatcher interjected. "Reads and writes beautifully, sews like an angel, wasted on dishwashing if you ask me." "I'm grateful for the work," Ruby said quietly. "Gratitude doesn't pay the rent," Mrs. Hatcher said. "You deserve better." An uncomfortable silence fell. Ruby focused on her stew, aware of Flint's thoughtful gaze. "This is delicious, Mrs. Hatcher," he finally said. "Reminds me of my mother's cooking." The conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, local news, the cattle business. Ruby contributed little, but found herself listening intently to Flint's stories of his travels. He spoke without bravado, describing the landscapes he'd crossed and people he'd met with genuine appreciation. After dinner, Ruby insisted on washing the dishes despite Mrs. Hatcher's protests. Alone in the kitchen, she could breathe again. The evening had been more pleasant than she'd expected, but Flint's presence unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite define. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the discomfort of standing in bright sunlight after too long in darkness. The door swung open and Flint appeared with a stack of plates. "Mrs. Hatcher sent me to help," he explained, setting them beside the wash basin. Ruby nodded, keeping her eyes on her task. "That's not necessary." "Maybe not, but it's polite." He rolled up his sleeves, revealing tanned, muscular forearms. "I'll dry if you'll wash." Ruby hesitated, then handed him a towel. They worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the gentle splashing of water and the clink of dishes. "You don't trust me," Flint said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Ruby glanced at him. "I don't know you, fair enough." He carefully dried a plate. "For what it's worth, I don't put much stock in town gossip." Ruby's hand stilled. "What gossip would that be, Mr. Caldwell, the kind that follows a new person in a small town?" His voice remained casual. "Especially when that person is a woman on her own." Ruby resumed washing, her movements more vigorous. "People will talk regardless of truth. That they will." Flint placed a dried plate on the stack. "My pa used to say the truth doesn't need defending, it just needs witnessing." "Your father sounds wise." "He was." A shadow crossed Flint's face. "Died in the war when I was 14, Confederate side. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Flint reached for another wet plate. "What about your family, Miss Lawson?" Ruby tensed. "Gone. There's just me now." Flint seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject. "Mrs. Hatcher mentioned you read. Any favorites?" The unexpected question caught Ruby off guard. "Wordsworth and Mr. Dickens." Flint's eyebrows rose. "Impressive. I'm partial to Mr. Twain myself. Found a copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer in a trading post last year. Couldn't put it down." For the next few minutes, they discussed books they'd read, favorite passages, stories that had stayed with them. Ruby found herself relaxing, drawn into genuine conversation for the first time in months. Flint was surprisingly well-read for a cowboy, and his observations were thoughtful without being pretentious. "My mother insisted I get some schooling," he explained when Ruby commented on his education. "Sent me to my aunt in St. Louis for 3 years. I was the oldest boy in my class, but I'm grateful for it now." They finished the dishes, and Ruby hung the damp towels to dry. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Caldwell." "Flint, please." His smile was warm. "Mr. Caldwell was my father." Ruby hesitated. "Good night, Flint." "Good night, Ruby." She slipped past him and up the stairs to her room, her mind unsettled. Flint Caldwell was nothing like she expected, neither dismissive of her like most townsfolk nor lecherous like the men she'd known at Madame Bouchard's. His interest seemed genuine, his respect unforced. It was dangerous to hope, Ruby reminded herself as she prepared for bed. Men like Flint Caldwell didn't court women with pasts like hers. Once he learned the truth, and in a town like Bitter Creek, his kindness would evaporate like morning dew under the harsh sun of reality. Better to keep her distance. Better to protect what little remained of her heart. The next morning, Ruby rose before dawn. She crept downstairs, careful not to wake the other occupants, and slipped out the back door. The air was cool and damp, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. This was her favorite time of day before the town awoke, before the stares and whispers began. Ruby followed a narrow path behind the buildings, making her way to Thornton's cafe. She'd sweep the floors and start the coffee before Mr. Thornton arrived. Perhaps her initiative would convince him to give her more hours. The cafe was dark and silent. Ruby let herself in with the key Mr. Thornton had reluctantly provided, lighting a lamp and setting to work. She hummed softly as she swept, an old lullaby her mother had sung. "That's pretty." Ruby spun around, broom clutched like a weapon. Flint stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "Sorry," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to startle you." "What are you doing here?" Ruby demanded, heart racing. Saw the light. "Thought Mr. Thornton might be opening early." Flint remained in the doorway, making no move to enter without invitation. "I was hoping for coffee before I meet with Barton about work." Ruby relaxed slightly. "Mr. Thornton won't be in for another hour, but I can make you coffee if you'd like." "I'd appreciate that." Flint stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. Ruby moved to the stove, adding wood and lighting the fire. She could feel Flint watching her as she worked, but his gaze didn't make her skin crawl the way other men's did. "You're up early," she commented, measuring coffee grounds. "Always have been." "Can't seem to sleep past sunrise, even when I try." Flint sat at the counter, placing his hat beside him. "You too, it seems. I like the quiet." Ruby set the coffee to boil before everyone else is about. Flint nodded, understanding. "Mind if I ask you something, Ruby?" She tensed. "Depends on the question." "Why Bitter Creek? It's not exactly a thriving metropolis." Ruby considered her answer carefully. "It was far enough from where I was, and the stagecoach ticket was what I could afford." "Running from something, aren't we all?" Ruby countered. Flint smiled slightly. "Fair point. I suppose we are in our own ways." The coffee began to bubble, filling the cafe with its rich aroma. Ruby poured a cup and placed it before Flint. "No cup for yourself?" he asked. "I need to finish sweeping before Mr. Thornton arrives." Flint reached for his wallet. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it neighborly hospitality." "Then I'm in your debt." He sipped the coffee, eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "This is good. Much better than the tar they serve at the saloon." Ruby resumed her sweeping, trying to ignore the warm feeling his compliment stirred. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable. "I heard Barton's wife needs help with household matters," Flint said after a while. "Seems she's expecting their fourth child and struggling to keep up." Ruby paused. "Is that so? Might be better work than dishwashing if you were interested." Ruby leaned on her broom. "Did Mrs. Hatcher put you up to this?" "No, madam. Just happened to hear it when I was asking about ranch work." Flint's expression was earnest. "Thought you might want to know." "Thank you, but I doubt Mrs. Barton would want someone like me in her home." "Someone like you?" Flint's brow furrowed. "You mean someone educated and hardworking?" Ruby gave him a sad smile. "You know what I mean, Mr. Caldwell." Before he could respond, the back door opened and Mr. Thornton entered. He stopped short at the sight of Flint. "Morning," Flint nodded politely. "Hope you don't mind. Miss Lawson was kind enough to make me coffee while I waited for you to open." Thornton's eyes narrowed as they shifted from Flint to Ruby. "I see." "I've finished sweeping, Mr. Thornton," Ruby said quickly, "and the coffee's fresh." "That'll be all for today, Miss Lawson," Thornton said coldly. "I'll have my wife help with the dishes." Ruby felt her face flush with humiliation. "But you said you needed me until noon. Plans change." Thornton's tone left no room for argument. "I'll pay you for the sweeping." Ruby set the broom aside and untied her apron, acutely aware of Flint watching the exchange. "As you wish, Mr. Thornton." She headed for the door, dignity the only thing keeping her spine straight. "Miss Lawson," Flint called after her. She paused without turning. "Thank you for the coffee." Ruby nodded and stepped outside into the strengthening daylight. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers opening their doors, a wagon rumbling past laden with supplies. She walked quickly, eyes downcast, wanting only to return to the safety of her room. "Ruby, wait up." She slowed reluctantly as Flint jogged to catch up with her. "I apologize," he said immediately. "I didn't mean to cause trouble for you back there. It's not your fault. Mr. Thornton was looking for an excuse." Ruby resumed walking, Flint falling into step beside her. "Still, I'm sorry," he frowned. "What he did wasn't right." "Few things are, in my experience." Ruby's voice was bitter. "Welcome to Bitter Creek, Mr. Caldwell, where the name suits the disposition." Flint was quiet for a moment. "Not everyone here is bitter, Ruby. No, give it time." She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Do I need a reason?" Men usually do. Something flashed in Flint's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or sadness. I'm not men, Ruby. I'm just one man who believes in common decency. Ruby studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. You don't know me. I'd like to. The simplicity of his statement caught her off guard. If you'd allow it. A wagon clattered past, breaking the moment. Ruby stepped back. I should go. Mrs. Hatcher might need help with breakfast. Flint nodded, not pressing. I've got that meeting with Barton, but I meant what I said about his wife needing help. Think about it. I will, Ruby promised, though she had little hope that Mrs. Barton would hire her once the town gossips had their say. They parted ways at the corner, Flint heading toward the livery stable to collect his horse while Ruby continued to the boarding house. Her emotions were a tangled mess, gratitude for Flint's kindness warring with fear of what it might mean, what it might cost her. Mrs. Hatcher was kneading bread dough when Ruby entered the kitchen. There you are. I was wondering where you'd gotten to so early. Mr. Thornton needed help at the cafe, Ruby explained, washing her hands at the pump. But his plans changed. Mrs. Hatcher's expression softened with understanding. His loss. You can help me with the bread if you'd like. I'm making extra to sell at the church social on Sunday. Ruby welcomed the distraction of physical labor. As they worked side by side, Mrs. Hatcher chatted about town happenings, careful to avoid topics that might distress Ruby. That Mr. Caldwell seems a decent sort, she commented eventually. Educated, too, from the sound of him. Ruby kept her eyes on the dough she was shaping. He mentioned Mrs. Barton might need household help. Did he now? Mrs. Hatcher's tone was deliberately casual. That would be better work than Thornton's cafe, I expect, if she'd have me. Mrs. Hatcher set down her rolling pin. Ruby Lawson, you listen to me. You're a good girl who's had bad circumstances. Anyone with eyes can see that. Margaret Barton's a fair-minded woman who judges people on their merits, not rumors. You sound like you know her well. We attended the same school as girls back in Ohio. She's got more sense than most in this town. Mrs. Hatcher patted Ruby's hand, leaving a dusting of flour. I could put in a word if you'd like. Hope flickered cautiously in Ruby's chest. I'd be grateful. Then it's settled. I'll walk over this afternoon while the bread's rising. Mrs. Hatcher beamed. Now, let's finish these loaves before the day gets away from us. The morning passed quickly in domestic tasks. Ruby helped prepare lunch for the boarders, currently just Mrs. Hatcher, Flint, and an elderly gentleman named Mr. Finch who rarely left his room. Flint didn't return for the meal, presumably still at the Barton Ranch. After lunch, Mrs. Hatcher donned her best shawl and set out to visit Margaret Barton, leaving Ruby to mind the house. Ruby used the quiet time to mend a tear in her dress, stitching by the window where the light was best. Her needle flashed in and out of the fabric, her thoughts similarly weaving between hope and caution. What would it be like to work in a proper home, to be treated with respect, to have regular wages and perhaps even a future beyond mere survival? Ruby hardly dared imagine it. A knock at the front door interrupted her reverie. Setting aside her mending, Ruby smoothed her apron and went to answer it. A well-dressed woman in her 30s stood on the porch, a young boy of about 5 clinging to her skirts. Her rounded belly suggested she was indeed expecting another child. Good afternoon, the woman said. I'm looking for Ruby Lawson. I'm Margaret Barton. Ruby's surprise must have shown on her face because Mrs. Barton smiled gently. Edith Hatcher speaks very highly of you, she continued. And rather than wait for her to bring you to me, I thought I'd come see you myself. May I come in? Of course. Ruby stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious. Please have a seat. Would you like some tea? That would be lovely. Mrs. Barton settled onto the sofa, her son climbing up beside her. This is my youngest, James. Say hello, James. The boy regarded Ruby solemnly. Hello. Ruby smiled at him. Hello, James. It's nice to meet you. While she prepared tea, Ruby's mind raced. Mrs. Barton had come herself. Was that a good sign? Or did she simply want to see the fallen woman with her own eyes before rejecting her? When Ruby returned with the tea tray, Mrs. Barton was showing James a small wooden horse she'd produced from her pocket. The boy was entirely absorbed in the toy. "My husband carved it," Mrs. Barton explained as Ruby poured the tea. "He's quite talented with a knife, though he'd never admit it, too busy being a cattleman." Ruby handed her a cup. "It's beautiful work. I'll tell him you said so." Mrs. Barton accepted the tea with thanks. "Now, Miss Lawson, Edith tells me you're looking for work, and I find myself in need of help. My other children are with their grandmother today, but when they are all home, it's quite overwhelming in my condition." "I understand. What sort of help do you need?" "Cooking, cleaning, minding the children when I need rest. It would be 6 days a week, with Sundays free for church if you wish. Room and board provided, of course, and $8 a month." Ruby nearly spilled her tea. $8 a month was twice what she made at Thornton's, even when he gave her full hours. "That's very generous," she managed. Mrs. Barton waved a hand dismissively. "It's fair pay for hard work. I won't pretend the children aren't a handful, especially my twins. They're 7 and mischievous as fox kits." "I like children," Ruby said honestly. Mrs. Barton studied her over the rim of her teacup. "Edith mentioned you might have faced some difficulties before coming to Bitter Creek." Ruby set her cup down, hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Barton, I won't lie to you. There are rumors about me in town, and some of them are true. I worked in a house in Cheyenne for 3 years, not by choice." Mrs. Barton's expression remained neutral. "Were you forced?" "Yes." The word felt raw in Ruby's throat. "I was 16 when a man promised me work as a maid in a fine house. By the time I realized what kind of house it was too late. They kept us locked in, controlled with threats and sometimes worse." Ruby touched the scar at her temple unconsciously. "How did you escape?" "One of the customers, a man passing through, left a window unlatched. I climbed out in the middle of the night and just ran. Worked my way from town to town until I ended up here." Mrs. Barton was quiet for a long moment, her eyes compassionate rather than judgmental. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Lawson. It can't have been easy to tell me this." Ruby braced herself for the polite rejection that would surely follow. Instead, Mrs. Barton said, "When can you start?" Ruby stared at her in disbelief. "You still want to hire me?" "Even knowing what was done to you," Mrs. Barton finished. "Miss Lawson, I judge people by their character, not their circumstances. You've been honest with me when you could have lied. That speaks to your character." Tears sprang to Ruby's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Barton. Margaret, please. If we're to share a household, we should be on familiar terms." She smiled warmly. "Can you start tomorrow? The twins return from their grandmother's and I could use the help." "Yes, I can be ready in the morning." They discussed the details of Ruby's duties over the remainder of the tea. James, bored with adult conversation, slid off the sofa to play with his horse on the rug. "My husband mentioned meeting you," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "Said you made excellent coffee at Thornton's this morning." Ruby blinked in surprise. "Your husband was at Thornton's?" "No, but Mr. Caldwell stopped by the ranch afterward and mentioned it. He spoke quite highly of you." Heat crept into Ruby's cheeks. "Mr. Caldwell is very kind." "He seems a good man," Margaret agreed. "Robert, my husband, offered him work with our herd. He'll be staying on for the season at least." The news that Flint would remain in Bitter Creek stirred mixed emotions in Ruby. Before she could examine them, the front door opened and Mrs. Hatcher returned, surprise evident on her face at finding Margaret already there. "Margaret Barton, I was just coming from your place." "Edith, I decided to see Miss Lawson for myself." Margaret rose, adjusting her shawl. and I'm pleased to say she's agreed to come work for us starting tomorrow." Mrs. Hatcher beamed. "Wonderful. Didn't I tell you she was exactly what you needed?" The women embraced like the old friends they were. James tugged at his mother's skirt, ready to leave. "I should get this little one home for his nap," Margaret said. "Miss Lawson will expect you around 8 tomorrow morning. Robert will send the wagon for you." "I'll be ready," Ruby promised. After the Bartons departed, Mrs. Hatcher clasped Ruby's hands. "I'm so happy for you, dear. The Bartons are good people. This is a fresh start, just like you wanted." "Thanks to you," Ruby said, squeezing the older woman's hands gratefully. "And perhaps a little thanks to Mr. Caldwell, too," Mrs. Hatcher added with a knowing smile. "He mentioned the position first, after all." Ruby looked away. "He was being neighborly. Hum." Mrs. Hatcher's tone was skeptical. "Well, let's get your things packed. Tomorrow's a new beginning." That evening, Ruby sat on her bed sorting her meager possessions. 3 dresses, undergarments, a shawl, her mother's locket, and Maggie's letter. Everything she owned in the world fit into a single carpet bag with room to spare. A knock at her door made her look up. "Come in." Flint stood in the doorway, hat in hand as always. "Mrs. Hatcher said you're leaving tomorrow." "Yes, Mrs. Barton hired me to help with the household and children." "That's good news." His smile seemed genuine. "The Bartons are decent folks, so I've heard." Ruby folded her spare apron. "Mrs. Barton mentioned you'll be working there too." "With the cattle, yes. Mr. Barton's expanding his herd." Flint leaned against the doorframe. "Looks like we'll be neighbors of sorts." Ruby nodded, unsure what to say. The thought of seeing Flint regularly brought that confusing mixture of anticipation and anxiety again. "I wanted to give you something before you go," Flint said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small book. "Thought you might enjoy it." Ruby accepted it curiously. "Leaves of Grass" by Walt Whitman. "It's not Wordsworth, but it's poetry, good poetry." Flint shuffled his feet slightly. "Reminded me of you somehow." Ruby ran her fingers over the worn cover. "I can't accept this. It must be valuable to you. I've read it already, several times." His eyes met hers. "I'd like you to have it." The simple gift touched Ruby deeply. Books were precious on the frontier, especially volumes of poetry. That Flint would part with one for her sake. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll treasure it." "Just return it when you're finished if you'd rather not keep it." Flint straightened. "I should let you finish packing. Early start tomorrow." "Flint," Ruby called as he turned to leave. He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for telling me about the position. For being kind when others weren't." His expression softened. "You deserve kindness, Ruby. Never doubt that." After he left, Ruby opened the book, finding a pressed wildflower marking a page. The poem it marked was titled "Song of the Open Road." Ruby read the lines, her heart beating faster at words that seemed to speak directly to her soul. "Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me leading wherever I choose. Freedom. Choice." The very things she'd been seeking since her escape from Madame Bouchard's. Ruby closed the book carefully and placed it in her carpet-bag. Whatever Flint Caldwell's intentions, he had given her something precious, hope in printed form. The Barton Ranch lay 5 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with a well-built main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings. Ruby arrived early the next morning, driven by one of the ranch hands in a wagon. Her stomach fluttered with nerves as they approached, but Margaret's warm welcome at the door eased her anxiety. "Come in, come in. The twins are absolutely wild this morning. I've told them you're here to help, not to torment." Margaret led Ruby through the comfortable home. "This will be your room. It's small but private." The room off the kitchen was indeed small but clean and pleasant, with a narrow bed, chest of drawers, and a tiny window overlooking the kitchen garden. Compared to some places Ruby had slept, it was luxurious. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Thank you. Put your things away and come to the kitchen when you're ready. I'll introduce you to the children." Left alone, Ruby quickly unpacked her few possessions. She changed into her work dress, pinned her hair neatly, and took a deep breath. This was her chance, a respectable position in a good home. She wouldn't squander it. In the kitchen, Margaret was attempting to oversee breakfast while simultaneously keeping two identical red-headed boys from what appeared to be an impromptu wrestling match. "Samuel, Simon, enough." Margaret's tone was firm but tired. "Miss Lawson, these hurricanes are my twins. Boys, this is Miss Lawson. She'll be helping us, and you will mind her as you would me." The boys paused their scuffle long enough to assess Ruby with identical curious gazes. "Can you ride a horse?" one asked. "Can you shoot a gun?" The other followed immediately. "Samuel, Simon," Margaret scolded. "Those aren't proper questions for breakfast." "I can ride," Ruby answered with a small smile, "though it's been some time. As for shooting, I've never had occasion to learn." This admission clearly lowered her in their estimation, but before they could comment, the back door opened and James burst in, followed by a girl of about 9 with long brown braids. "Papa says the new calf is doing better," the girl announced. "Oh, you must be Miss Lawson." "I'm Elizabeth, but everyone calls me Lizzie." She executed a small curtsy that made Ruby warm to her immediately. "It's nice to meet you, Lizzie. And you too, Samuel and Simon, though I'm not sure which is which yet." "I'm Samuel," said the one on the left. "He's lying." "He's Simon," countered the other. "Boys," Margaret warned, "don't start that game again. Samuel has a scar on his chin from falling out of the hayloft last summer. That's how you can tell them apart, Miss Lawson." Ruby nodded, making a mental note. "Would you like me to finish preparing breakfast while you sit, Mrs. Barton? You look tired." Relief washed over Margaret's face. "That would be wonderful. The bread needs slicing and the eggs are ready to scramble." Ruby took over the cooking with practiced efficiency, soon setting a hearty breakfast on the table. The children dug in hungrily while Margaret sipped her tea, looking grateful for the moment of relative peace. "My husband should be in shortly," she told Ruby. "He wanted to check on a sick calf first thing." As if summoned by her words, the door opened again and Robert Barton entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a weathered face that creased into a smile at the sight of his family. "Good morning, all," he greeted, bending to kiss Margaret's cheek. "Miss Lawson, welcome to our home. I trust the ride out wasn't too dusty." "Not at all, Mr. Barton. Thank you for sending the wagon. Least I could do." He took his place at the head of the table. "Caldwell's already earned his keep this morning, helping with that sickly calf. Man knows his way around livestock." Ruby kept her expression neutral at the mention of Flint, focusing on serving Mr. Barton his breakfast. "Will Mr. Caldwell be joining us for meals?" Margaret asked. "No, he's taking his meals with the other hands at the bunkhouse. Said he didn't want special treatment." Robert accepted a cup of coffee from Ruby with thanks. "Good man, that Caldwell. Shows respect." The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity as Ruby learned the rhythms of the household. Margaret showed her where everything was kept, explained the children's routines, and outlined her duties. By noon, Ruby had helped prepare lunch, started a batch of laundry, and intervened in 2 disputes between the twins. "You're a natural with children," Margaret commented as they watched the younger ones play in the yard after lunch. Lizzie had been entrusted with keeping an eye on them while Ruby and Margaret hung laundry on the line. "They're wonderful children," Ruby said honestly. "Lively, but sweet." "Wait until you've been here a week," Margaret laughed. "You might revise that opinion. The twins are particularly inventive when it comes to mischief." Ruby smiled, pinning a sheet to the line. My mother used to say energy in children is a blessing, even when it exhausts the adults around them. Your mother sounds wise. Is she still living? No, she died when I was 12. My father had already passed the year before. Margaret's face softened with sympathy. I'm sorry. It must have been difficult being so young and alone. Ruby nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the white linens billowing in the breeze. Mr. Caldwell seems to have made an impression on you, Margaret said after a time, her tone carefully neutral. Ruby nearly dropped the clothespin she was holding. I hardly know him. Yet he went out of his way to mention you to Robert and to suggest you for this position. Margaret gave her a sidelong glance. He's a handsome man. I hadn't noticed, Ruby lied. Margaret's laugh was kind rather than mocking. Of course not. Just as I never noticed how handsome Robert was when he came to work for my father's ranch all those years ago. Ruby busied herself with straightening a pillowcase on the line. Mr. Caldwell is a gentleman, that's all. They're rare enough that one takes notice. Indeed they are. Margaret let the subject drop, but her knowing smile remained. As the days passed, Ruby settled into life at the Barton Ranch. The work was hard but satisfying, the family kind and appreciative. The children, even the mischievous twins, responded well to her gentle but firm guidance. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Ruby felt part of something good and wholesome. She saw Flint occasionally, usually at a distance as he worked with the cattle or repaired fences. Sometimes he'd tip his hat to her if their eyes met across the yard, and she'd nod in acknowledgement before returning to her tasks. They rarely spoke, their duties keeping them in separate spheres of the ranch's life. One evening about 2 weeks after Ruby's arrival, she sat on the back porch shelling peas after the children were in bed. Margaret had retired early, exhausted by her pregnancy, and Robert was in town on business. The ranch was peaceful, bathed in the golden light of sunset. The sound of approaching footsteps made Ruby look up. Flint walked toward the house, his day's work evidently finished. "Evening, Miss Lawson," he called, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Mr. Caldwell." Ruby nodded, continuing her task. "Mind if I join you?" "Unless you'd prefer solitude." Ruby hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Please." Flint removed his hat and sat, sighing contentedly as he stretched his long legs. "Beautiful evening." "It is." Ruby glanced at him sideways. His profile was striking in the fading light, strong and clean-cut. "How are you finding life at the Bartons?" he asked, turning to meet her gaze. "Wonderful," Ruby admitted. "They're good people. The children are delightful, even the twins." Flint's eyes twinkled with amusement. Ruby laughed softly. "Even them. Though they did put a frog in my apron pocket yesterday. Sounds about right. They put a snake in my boot last week." Flint chuckled at the memory. "Harmless garter snake, thankfully." They fell into easy conversation, discussing the children's antics, the day's work, the changing weather. Ruby found herself relaxing in Flint's company, her usual guardedness slipping away in the face of his undemanding presence. "I've been reading your book," she told him, setting aside the finished peas. "Whitman has a unique voice, different from what I'm used to but powerful. That he does." Flint smiled. "Any favorites so far? Song of the Open Road. It speaks to something in me, I think." "The longing for freedom, for possibility." Flint nodded. "That's why I marked it. Seemed fitting somehow." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Ruby looked away first, suddenly aware of how intimate the moment felt. "You never said why you left Texas," she said, changing the subject. Flint was quiet for a moment. "Same reason as you, I expect. Needed a fresh start." "Were you running from something?" His smile turned wry. More like running toward something. Wasn't sure what exactly, but I knew it wasn't in Texas anymore. And have you found it? Whatever you were looking for. Flint's gaze was steady. I'm beginning to think I might have. The implication in his words made Ruby's heart beat faster. She stood abruptly, gathering the bowl of shelled peas. I should take these inside. It's getting late. Flint rose as well, returning his hat to his head. Of course. Thank you for the company, Ruby. The use of her first name, spoken with such gentle familiarity, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. Good night, Flint, she replied softly, before disappearing into the house. In her small room that night, Ruby found sleep elusive. She lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and thinking of Flint Caldwell. His kindness unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. Cruelty, she understood. Kindness with no apparent motive was foreign territory. She reached for Whitman's book on her bedside table, opening to Song of the Open Road, again. The words seemed to pulse with life in the lamplight. From this hour I ordain myself loosed of limits and imaginary lines, going where I list, my own master total and absolute, listening to others, considering well what they say, pausing, searching, receiving, contemplating, gently, but with undeniable will, divesting myself of the holds that would hold me. Freedom. Not just physical freedom, she'd achieved that when she escaped Madame Bouchard's, but freedom of the spirit. Freedom to trust, to hope, perhaps even to love. The thought made Ruby close the book quickly. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a risk too great to take. Men had proven themselves untrustworthy too many times in her life. Yet Flint was different. She couldn't deny it, much as she tried. There was an integrity about him, a steadiness that called to something deep within her. And the way he looked at her not with lust or pity, but with genuine interest, as if she were a person of value, was more intoxicating than any words of flattery could ever be. Ruby extinguished her lamp and closed her eyes, determined to put such thoughts from her mind. She had a good position now, respect, safety. That was enough. It had to be enough. The following weeks brought a steady rhythm to ranch life. The days grew shorter as autumn approached, the mornings crisp with the promise of winter to come. Ruby thrived under Margaret's kind guidance, gaining confidence in her role within the household. The children had accepted her completely, even the twins now viewing her as an ally rather than an adversary. Lizzie particularly attached herself to Ruby, often following her around the kitchen or sitting quietly nearby while Ruby mended clothes, asking thoughtful questions about everything from cooking to literature. "Were you ever in love, Miss Lawson?" Lizzie asked one rainy afternoon as they sat by the fire, Ruby teaching her to darn a sock. The question caught Ruby off guard. "What makes you ask that?" Lizzie shrugged. "You're pretty and nice. I thought maybe you had a beau once." Ruby focused on her stitching. "No, I've never been in love." "Mr. Caldwell isn't married," Lizzie continued artlessly. "Papa says he's a good man, steady and reliable." "Lizzie," Ruby admonished gently, "it isn't proper to matchmake." "Why not? Mama says you deserve happiness after all you've been through." At Ruby's startled look, Lizzie added, "I wasn't eavesdropping, honest. I just heard her telling Papa." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. What exactly had Margaret told Robert about her past? And how much had Lizzie overheard? "Your mother is very kind," Ruby said carefully. "But my happiness is not for others to arrange." Lizzie considered this. "I suppose. But Mr. Caldwell looks at you the way Papa looks at Mama sometimes, like you're something special." Ruby's heart skipped a beat. "Lizzie, that's enough. Your sock won't darn itself." The girl sighed dramatically, but returned her attention to her sewing. Ruby tried to steady her hands, unsettled by Lizzie's observations. Was she that transparent? And more concerning, was Flint's interest as obvious to everyone else as it apparently was to a 9-year-old girl? The next day brought clear skies and a flurry of activity as the ranch prepared for winter. Robert and the hands, including Flint, were out from dawn checking fences and moving cattle to more sheltered pastures. Ruby and Margaret spent the morning preserving the last of the garden's harvest, the kitchen warm and fragrant with spices. "You've been quiet today," Margaret observed as they sealed jars of pickled beets. "Is something troubling you?" Ruby hesitated. "Lizzie said something yesterday that gave me pause." "Oh, what was that?" She mentioned that you had told Mr. Barton about my past. Ruby kept her tone neutral, though anxiety churned in her stomach. I wondered how much she might have overheard. Margaret's face softened with understanding. "Nothing specific, I assure you. Robert knows only that you survived difficult circumstances before coming here. As for Lizzie, she heard only that you'd had hardships. Children often pick up fragments of adult conversations, but she knows nothing that would harm you." Relief washed over Ruby. "Thank you. I don't mean to seem ungrateful. It's just, your past is your own to share or keep private," Margaret finished for her. "I understand completely and I apologize if I overstepped." "You didn't," Ruby assured her. "You've been more than kind." Margaret smiled, placing a maternal hand on Ruby's. "You're a remarkable young woman, Ruby. In the short time you've been here, you've become invaluable to us. The children adore you, and I consider you not just an employee but a friend." Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes. "I feel the same. This place, your family, it's become more of a home to me than anywhere since I lost my parents. Then it's settled. Your family now, whether you like it or not." Margaret squeezed her hand before returning to the preserving, and family looks out for one another's happiness. Ruby recognized the gentle hint in Margaret's words, but chose not to address it. Instead, she changed the subject to safer topics: the twins' upcoming birthday, plans for Thanksgiving, the baby's expected arrival in early December. That evening, as Ruby helped the children prepare for bed, a commotion in the yard drew her attention. Looking out the window, she saw several ranch hands dismounting from their horses, Flint among them. They appeared agitated, Robert Barton gesturing emphatically as he spoke to them. "What's happening?" Lizzie asked, joining Ruby at the window. "I'm not sure. Perhaps your father's had news from town." Ruby hurried the children through their bedtime routines, curiosity gnawing at her. When she finally made her way downstairs, Margaret was standing in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. "What is it?" Ruby asked. "Is something wrong?" "Robert says there's word of an early blizzard moving in. They've been racing to bring in the outlying cattle." Margaret pressed a hand to her belly, wincing slightly. "Some are still missing in the north pasture." Ruby's concern shifted immediately to Margaret. "Are you in pain? Should I send for the doctor?" No, just the baby moving. He's restless today." Margaret attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Robert's sending most of the men back out to find the missing cattle before the storm hits. Flint's leading one group." The mention of Flint's name sent a spike of fear through Ruby. How bad is the storm expected to be? "Bad enough that Robert's worried." Margaret sank into a kitchen chair. "Wyoming blizzards are nothing to trifle with, especially this early in the season. They can appear suddenly and last for days." Ruby busied herself making tea, trying to quell her rising anxiety. She'd heard stories of men lost in blizzards, found frozen in spring thaws, sometimes just yards from safety they couldn't see through the whiteout conditions. The back door opened and Robert entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Snow already." "It's starting earlier than we thought," he told Margaret grimly. "I've sent Wilson to town to warn folks and fetch the doctor for the Jacobson place their boys taken ill. The rest are heading to the north pasture with Flint." "Shouldn't they wait until morning?" Ruby asked, unable to keep silent. "If the storm's already starting, can't afford to lose those cattle," Robert said, though his expression was troubled. "And Caldwell knows what he's doing. Says he's weathered worse in the Dakotas." Margaret reached for her husband's hand. "Be careful, Robert, we need you here." "I'm staying put," he assured her. "Someone's got to keep an eye on things here. Flint insisted I stay with you and the children." Ruby's estimation of Flint rose even higher. He'd taken the dangerous task himself rather than risking the ranch owner, a man with a family depending on him. The night grew increasingly wild as the storm gathered strength. Wind howled around the eaves of the house, and snow accumulated rapidly, blanketing the world in white. Ruby helped Margaret prepare a hearty stew and fresh bread for when the men returned, though as the hours passed, her hope of their return before morning diminished. The children were long asleep, and Margaret had finally been persuaded to rest, leaving Ruby and Robert keeping vigil in the kitchen. Robert paced restlessly, checking the windows every few minutes, though there was nothing to see but swirling snow in the lantern light. "They should have been back by now," he muttered, more to himself than to Ruby. "Perhaps they found shelter in the line shack," Ruby suggested, remembering mentions of the small cabin in the north pasture, if they were lucky. Robert ran a hand through his hair. "Damn stubborn cattle. Damn stubborn Caldwell, too, insisting on going himself." Ruby's hands trembled slightly as she wiped down the already clean kitchen table. "He'll bring them back safely. He seems the capable sort." Robert gave her a sharp look. "He is, and he seems particularly motivated to return in one piece these days." Before Ruby could respond to the implication in his words, a faint shout carried over the howling wind. Robert was at the door in an instant, peering into the storm. "It's them," he exclaimed, grabbing his coat. "Ruby, stoke the fire and get the stew hot. They'll be half frozen." Ruby sprang into action, building up the fire and placing the pot of stew over the heat. She set out bowls and bread, then filled the kettle for coffee. Through the window, she could make out shadowy figures emerging from the blinding snow, leading horses and cattle. The back door burst open, bringing a gust of frigid air and swirling snow. Men stumbled in, their clothes encrusted with ice, faces red and chapped from the wind. Ruby counted them anxiously as they entered 5, 6, 7. Where was Flint? Then he appeared in the doorway, supporting a younger ranch hand who limped badly. Flint's face was haggard with exhaustion, his beard frosted with ice, but his eyes found Ruby's immediately across the room. Something in his gaze, relief perhaps, or simple recognition, made her heart contract painfully. "Jenkins took a fall," Flint explained to Robert as they helped the injured man to a chair. "Twisted his knee, but nothing's broken." "The cattle?" Robert asked. "All accounted for. Got them into the south pasture shelters." Flint removed his ice-crusted gloves with difficulty. "Storm's getting worse by the minute. We almost didn't make it back." Ruby moved among the men, serving bowls of steaming stew and pouring coffee. When she reached Flint, their fingers brushed as she handed him the bowl. His were like ice. "You're frozen through," she murmured. "Worth it to see a friendly face," he replied quietly, his voice rough from the cold. Ruby felt color rise to her cheeks. "Eat before it gets cold." "I'll fetch more blankets." As she turned to leave, Flint caught her wrist gently. "Ruby." She looked back at him, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "I thought of you out there," he said simply. It helped. Ruby didn't know how to respond to such a naked admission. She nodded once and slipped from his grasp, retreating to the linen closet where she could collect both blankets and her composure. By the time she returned, Margaret had awakened and joined them, fussing over the men like a mother hen despite her advanced pregnancy. Ruby distributed blankets, ensuring Flint received the warmest one, though she avoided his eyes as she draped it around his shoulders. The ranch hands gradually thawed, their spirits reviving with food and warmth. Jenkins' knee was bandaged, and plans were made for the men to sleep in the house rather than attempting the treacherous walk to the bunkhouse in the blizzard. Pallets were arranged in the main room, close to the fire. As the others settled in for the night, Ruby made a final round with the coffee pot. Flint sat slightly apart from the group, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth. He looked up as she approached. "More coffee," she offered. "Please." He held out his cup, now held steadily in hands that had regained their color. "Thank you for all this, the food, the blankets. It's nothing. I'm just glad you all returned safely." Ruby poured the coffee, then hesitated. "You were very brave going out in the storm." Flint shrugged. "Just doing my job." "No, you took the most dangerous position yourself rather than risking Mr. Barton. That's more than just doing your job." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe I was trying to impress someone." Ruby's heartbeat quickened. "That would be foolish." "I've been called worse." His eyes held hers. "Worth it, though." Before Ruby could respond, Margaret called her name from across the room, needing help with preparing the sleeping arrangements. Ruby excused herself, oddly grateful for the interruption. Flint Caldwell was becoming increasingly difficult to resist, and her carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble. The blizzard raged for 3 days, keeping everyone confined to the house. The close quarters created an unexpected intimacy among the household and the stranded ranch hands. Meals were communal affairs, stories were shared around the fire, and even the children were on their best behavior, sensing the seriousness of the situation. Ruby found herself working alongside Flint on several occasions preparing meals, entertaining the children with improvised games, reinforcing the kitchen door when the wind threatened to tear it from its hinges. Each interaction deepened her awareness of him, of his quiet competence, his gentle humor, his unfailing kindness to everyone from Margaret to the youngest twin. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the storm finally began to abate. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a transformed landscape buried under feet of snow. The men ventured out to check on the livestock and clear paths between the buildings. Ruby stood at the kitchen window, watching Flint lead a team of men toward the barn, his tall figure easily recognizable even bundled against the cold. Something had shifted between them during these confined days, a growing ease, a deepening connection that both thrilled and terrified her. "He's a good man," Margaret said softly, coming to stand beside Ruby. "One of the best Roberts ever hired." Ruby didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes, he seems to be. He cares for you." Margaret's tone was gentle but direct. "Anyone with eyes can see it." "He doesn't know me," Ruby protested weakly. "Not really." "Doesn't he?" Margaret placed a hand on Ruby's shoulder. "You've shared meals, conversation, laughter. He's seen your kindness to the children, your dedication to your work, your courage during the storm. What more does he need to know?" Everything, Ruby thought. He needs to know everything. The shame, the degradation, the things done to her and the things she'd done to survive. As if reading her thoughts, Margaret continued, "The past shapes us, Ruby, but it doesn't define us. Whatever happened before you came here, it's part of your story, but it's not the whole story." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes. "Some things can't be forgotten, Margaret, or forgiven." "By whom? Others or yourself?" Margaret squeezed her shoulder gently. "From what I can see, Flint Caldwell isn't interested in your past. He's interested in your present and possibly your future." Ruby remained silent, watching as Flint directed the men clearing snow from the barn doors. His leadership was natural, unforced, his strength evident in every movement. "Just think about it," Margaret urged. That's all I ask. Later that day, as normalcy began to return to the ranch, Ruby took advantage of a break in her duties to step outside for fresh air. The world was pristine and silent, the snow glittering in the late afternoon sun. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and ventured a short distance from the house, reveling in the crisp, clean air after days of confinement. Beautiful, isn't it? Ruby turned to find Flint approaching, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He'd clearly been working hard, his face flushed with exertion beneath his hat. It is, she agreed, though I imagine the cattle don't appreciate it much. They're doing all right, the shelter's held up well. Flint came to stand beside her, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. We were lucky. Could have been much worse. Thanks to you and the others. Flint shrugged off the compliment. We all did what needed doing. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the distant shouts of the other men still working to clear paths. I've been thinking, Flint said finally, about what comes next. Ruby glanced at him. Next, winter's setting in. I've signed on with Barton through spring, but after that. He trailed off, then turned to face her directly. Ruby, I need to ask you something. Her heart began to race. Yes. There's a social at the church in town next Sunday. The storm's delayed it a week, but it's still happening. Would you consider going with me? Of all the things Ruby had expected him to say, this simple invitation wasn't one of them. A social. Just an evening of music, some dancing, refreshments. Flint's expression was earnest. I'd be honored to escort you if you'd allow it. Ruby's mind whirled with implications. Going to a social in town on Flint's arm would be a public declaration of something. Friendship at the very least, possibly more. The town gossips would have a field day. I don't think that would be wise, she said softly. People talk, Flint. They already talk about me. Let them talk. There was an edge to his voice now. I don't give a damn what they say. You should. A man's reputation is his own to risk. Flint took a step closer. Ruby, I know there are things in your past that pain you, things you think make you unworthy somehow. I'm not asking you to tell me about them. I'm just asking for the chance to know you better here and now. Ruby felt tears threatening again. Why? Why would you want to be seen with someone like me? Someone like you? Flint's expression softened. You mean someone brave enough to start over with nothing but determination. Someone kind enough to win the hearts of 4 children in a matter of weeks. Someone who works harder than anyone I've ever met, never complaining, always thinking of others first. Each word struck Ruby like a physical blow, challenging the narrative she'd constructed about herself. You don't understand. Then help me understand. Flint reached for her hand, holding it gently between his own. Ruby, whatever happened before whatever was done to you, it doesn't change who you are now. And who am I now? She whispered. The woman I can't stop thinking about. Flint's voice was low, intimate. The woman whose smile makes my day brighter, whose courage inspires me, whose gentleness with those children shows the kind of heart she has. Ruby looked down at their joined hands, his large and work roughened, hers smaller but equally calloused from labor. I was forced into a brothel when I was 16, she said, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. For 3 years I was used by men who paid for the privilege. She felt Flint's hands tighten slightly around hers, but he didn't pull away as she'd expected. When she dared to look up, his expression held not disgust but a controlled anger that she instinctively understood was not directed at her. You were a child, he said, his voice tight. And you were enslaved. That's not on you, Ruby, not one bit of it. The town doesn't see it that way. They call me used goods. The cruel phrase that had followed her since her arrival in Bitter Creek hung in the air between them. Then they're blind fools. Flint's eyes blazed with conviction. And I don't give a damn about their judgment. I care about you, Ruby Lawson. Just you, as you are now." Something broke open inside Ruby at his words, a dam holding back years of shame and self-loathing. Tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing in the cold air. "I don't know how to believe that," she admitted. "I don't know how to believe I deserve anything good." Flint released one of her hands to gently wipe a tear from her cheek. "Then let me help you believe it, one day at a time, starting with a church social where you can hold your head high on my arm." Ruby looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception or pity and finding none. Only warmth, respect, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "All right," she said finally. "I'll go to the social with you." Flint's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Thank you. You won't regret it, I promise." As they walked back to the house together, their breath mingling in the cold air, Ruby felt something unfamiliar unfurling in her chest, fragile as a new leaf, but undeniably present. It might have been hope. The church social loomed in Ruby's thoughts all week. Margaret, delighted when Ruby shared her plans, insisted on helping her prepare a suitable dress for the occasion. One of Margaret's own gowns from before her pregnancy, a lovely creation of deep green wool that complemented Ruby's coloring, was altered to fit Ruby's slimmer frame. "You look beautiful," Margaret declared on Sunday afternoon as Ruby twirled before her. "That color brings out your eyes." Ruby smoothed the unfamiliar fabric nervously. "It's too fine for me." "Nonsense. It's exactly right." Margaret adjusted the collar slightly. "Flint won't be able to take his eyes off you." Ruby blushed. "It's just a social. Hum." Margaret's skeptical tone made Ruby smile despite her nerves. "Just remember to enjoy yourself. You deserve some happiness, Ruby." Flint arrived promptly at 4, driving a freshly brushed wagon borrowed from Robert. He wore a clean shirt and his best vest, his hair still damp from washing. When Ruby appeared on the porch, his expression of frank admiration sent warmth coursing through her. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." Ruby settled her skirts around her, heart fluttering at the casual intimacy of sitting beside him on the narrow seat. The Barton children clustered around the wagon, the twins demanding souvenirs from town and Lizzie making Flint promise to bring Ruby home at a reasonable hour, a perfect imitation of her mother that made the adults laugh. "We'll be back before you know it," Flint assured them as he flicked the reins and set the horses in motion. The journey to town was filled with easy conversation. Flint pointed out landmarks along the way, sharing stories of his first impressions of the area. Ruby found herself relaxing in his company, her anxiety about the social gradually receding, until they reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek. "We don't have to do this," Flint said quietly, noticing her tension as the church came into view. "We can turn around right now if you'd prefer." Ruby squared her shoulders. "No, I want to go." Flint's smile was warm with approval. "That's my girl." The simple phrase, "my girl," sent a thrill through Ruby that had nothing to do with fear. The churchyard was already filled with wagons and horses when they arrived. Music and laughter spilled from the open doors, lanterns illuminating the gathering dusk. Flint helped Ruby down from the wagon, offering his arm with a formality that made her smile. "Ready?" he asked. Ruby took a deep breath and placed her hand on his arm. "Ready." Heads turned as they entered the church. Conversation faltered briefly before resuming with increased intensity. Ruby kept her gaze fixed forward, chin lifted in defiance of the stares and whispers. "Ruby Lawson." Mrs. Hatcher's delighted voice cut through the murmurs. The older woman hurried toward them, arms outstretched. "And Mr. Caldwell, how wonderful to see you both." Her genuine welcome eased some of the tension in Ruby's shoulders. "Hello, Mrs. Hatcher, it's good to see you too. The Bartons treating you well. You look marvelous, dear. That color suits you perfectly. Mrs. Hatcher beamed at them both. And Mr. Caldwell, you clean up nicely indeed, Flint chuckled. Thank you, madam. The Bartons send their regards. Mrs. Barton's condition prevents her from traveling. Of course, of course. Not long now, I expect. Mrs. Hatcher linked her arm through Ruby's free one. Come, let me introduce you to some decent folk. Not everyone in this town is a narrow-minded gossip, you know. With Mrs. Hatcher's formidable presence providing a buffer, Ruby found herself gradually accepted into small groups of conversation. Not everyone was welcoming. Mrs. Thornton pointedly turned her back when Ruby approached, and several older women exchanged meaningful glances, but enough people followed Mrs. Hatcher's lead that Ruby began to relax. Flint remained steadfastly at her side, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. His easy confidence seemed to influence others' behavior. Several men who might have snubbed Ruby alone nodded respectfully when approaching them together. When the music began in earnest, Flint turned to Ruby with a questioning look. May I have this dance, Miss Lawson? Ruby hesitated. I'm not sure I remember how. It's been many years. Then we'll learn together. Flint led her to the dance floor where other couples were already forming lines for a Virginia reel. The dance was lively and required more concentration than grace. Ruby found herself laughing as they circled and turned, her earlier anxiety forgotten in the simple joy of movement and music. Flint was a better dancer than he'd let on, guiding her through the steps with confidence. When the music slowed to a waltz, Flint drew her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers with gentle firmness. Is this all right? He asked, his voice low. Ruby nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The last time she had danced with a man had been with her father, shortly before his death. This was entirely different. Flint's solid presence, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way his eyes never left her face as they moved together in perfect rhythm. You're a natural, he murmured as they turned gracefully around the floor. I had a good teacher once, my father. Ruby smiled at the memory. He said every girl should know how to dance properly. Wise man. Flint's expression softened. He'd be proud of you, Ruby. The simple statement brought unexpected tears to her eyes. I hope so. They danced until Ruby's cheeks were flushed and her feet began to ache pleasantly in her best shoes. When Flint suggested they step outside for some air, she gratefully accepted. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing in the black velvet sky. Ruby drew her shawl closer around her shoulders as they walked a short distance from the church, finding a quiet spot near a stand of bare, branched cottonwoods. Are you enjoying yourself? Flint asked. More than I expected to, Ruby admitted. Thank you for bringing me. Thank you for coming. Flint's voice was warm in the darkness. You've shown more courage tonight than most men I know show in a lifetime. Ruby shook her head. It's just a social. It's more than that, and you know it. Flint turned to face her. You face down this town's judgment with your head high. That takes real courage. In the faint light spilling from the church windows, Ruby could see the admiration in his eyes. It humbled her, this unearned regard from a man who seemed to see only the best in her. Flint, she began hesitantly, I need to know something, anything. Why me? Of all the women you could court, respectable women with unblemished pasts, why choose someone like me? Flint was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. My pa had this old watch. Nothing fancy, just a battered silver timepiece his father had given him. During the war, it stopped a bullet that would have killed him, left a dent in the case, cracked the crystal. After that, he valued it more, not less, said it had proven its worth. He stepped closer, close enough that Ruby could feel the warmth radiating from him. You've been through hell, Ruby Lawson. And you've come out the other side not unscathed, but unbroken, strong in the places where life tried to break you. That kind of strength, that kind of resilience, it's rare and precious. His hand came up to cup her cheek gently. I don't want some sheltered girl who's never faced hardship. I want a woman who knows the world's darkness and still chooses to see light. A woman who's been tested and not found wanting. Ruby's heart pounded in her chest. They said I was used goods, she whispered, giving voice to the cruel phrase that had followed her. Flint's expression hardened momentarily before softening into something so tender it made her breath catch. Then I'll use my life to love you, he said simply. Every day for as long as you'll let me. The words so direct, so unambiguous in their meaning struck Ruby with the force of physical impact. Love, she echoed, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. Yes, Ruby, love. Flint's thumb stroked her cheek gently. I love you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you in Peterson's store, trying so hard to hold your head high when the whole town wanted to see you bow it in shame. Tears spilled from Ruby's eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. No one's ever loved me that way, she whispered. The way a man loves a woman he respects. Then they were blind fools, Flint said fiercely, because you, Ruby Lawson, are the most lovable woman I've ever known. He bent his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Ruby rose on her tiptoes to meet him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper of contact. Yet it sent fire racing through her veins, awakening feelings she'd thought long dead or worse, irreparably tainted by her past. This was nothing like the brutal, demanding kisses she'd endured at Madame Bouchard's. This was an offering, not a taking. A promise, not a demand. When they parted, Flint rested his forehead against hers. I'll court you properly, Ruby, as long as it takes for you to trust what's between us. I'm not asking for promises tonight. Ruby's hands had somehow found their way to his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her palms. And if I'm never ready, then I'll still count myself fortunate to have known you. His sincerity was unmistakable. But I hope with time you might come to feel for me what I feel for you. Ruby took a deep breath, gathering courage. I think perhaps I already do, she admitted softly. I'm just afraid to trust it, to trust myself. Flint's smile was radiant even in the dim light. Then we'll take it one day at a time. Together. Together. The word held such promise, such possibility. Ruby had been alone for so long, fighting, surviving, never daring to hope for more than momentary safety. The idea of a shared future, of someone walking beside her through life's joys and sorrows, was almost too much to comprehend. Yet standing here in Flint's arms, beneath a canopy of stars, it suddenly seemed not just possible but inevitable. As if all the crooked paths of her life had been leading her here to this man, to this moment of choice. Together, she echoed, the word a vow on her lips. Flint sealed it with another kiss, deeper this time but still achingly gentle. Ruby melted into him, allowing herself for the first time in years to simply feel without fear, to embrace joy without waiting for the blow that would surely follow. When they finally returned to the church, hand in hand, Ruby felt as if she'd been transformed not by Flint's love alone, but by her own courage in accepting it, in choosing to believe she was worthy of it. They danced once more before the evening concluded, oblivious to the curious glances and whispered comments around them. In Flint's arms, moving to the sweet strains of a waltz, Ruby finally understood what Whitman had meant in his poem. From this hour I ordain myself loosed of limits and imaginary lines. She was free. Not just from Madame Bouchard's, not just from her past, but from the prison of shame she'd built around her heart. Free to love and be loved, free to begin again. The months that followed were the happiest of Ruby's life. Flint courted her with patient determination, respecting her boundaries while gradually helping her dismantle the walls around her heart. They shared walks in the crisp winter sunshine, long conversations by the fire after the children were asleep, stolen kisses in the barn when chores brought them together. Margaret gave birth to a healthy boy in early December, whom they named Joseph after Robert's father. Ruby found herself promoted from household help to something closer to family, Margaret insisting she was indispensable with the new baby demanding so much attention. Christmas at the Barton Ranch was a joyous affair, simple but heartfelt. The children received handmade gifts and a few store-bought treats. Ruby was surprised with presents from the entire family, a beautiful shawl from Margaret and Robert, drawings from the children, and from Flint, a delicate silver locket to replace the one she'd lost years ago. "It's too much," she protested when he fastened it around her neck on Christmas Eve. "It's not nearly enough," he countered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But it's a start." As winter gave way to spring, Ruby and Flint's courtship deepened. The town's gossip gradually subsided as the sight of them together became commonplace. Some still whispered, of course, but increasing numbers nodded respectfully when Ruby passed, won over by her quiet dignity and the obvious devotion between her and the well-respected Cowboy. One evening in late April, as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name, Flint took Ruby's hand and led her to a fallen log overlooking the water. "I've been thinking," he began, his expression unusually serious. Ruby's heart skipped a beat. "About what?" "The future. Our future." Flint took both her hands in his. "My contract with Barton ends next month." Fear clutched at Ruby's heart. "You're leaving?" "No." Flint's grip tightened reassuringly. "At least not without you. Never without you again if I have any say in it." Relief washed through her. "What are you saying, Flint?" "I'm saying I want to marry you, Ruby Lawson." His blue eyes were steady on hers. "I love you. I want to build a life with you." Though she had begun to hope for this, the reality of his proposal still left Ruby breathless. "Flint, are you sure?" "Your reputation will only be improved by marrying the most courageous, kind-hearted woman in Wyoming territory." Flint released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a simple gold band. "It was my mother's. My pa gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found a woman worthy of it." Tears blurred Ruby's vision as he held the ring before her. "And you think I'm worthy?" "I know you are." Flint's voice was husky with emotion. "The question is, do you think I'm worthy of you?" Ruby laughed through her tears at the absurdity of the question. "You're the best man I've ever known, Flint Caldwell." "Is that a yes, then?" "Yes." Ruby's heart felt as if it might burst from joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." Flint slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of devotion. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been saving," he told her. "Enough to buy a small place of our own. Barton's offered to sell me a piece of his northern grazing land. Says it would be good to have a trusted neighbor." Ruby could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Our own ranch. It would be small to start, hard work, but we'd build it together." Flint's eyes were alight with dreams. "A place where children could grow up free and happy. Our children, Ruby. Our children." The words sent a wave of emotion through Ruby so powerful she could only cling to Flint, pressing her face against his chest as tears flowed freely. Children born of love, not violence or exploitation. Children who would never know the hardships she had faced. "Yes," she whispered against his shirt. "Yes to all of it." They were married in the Bitter Creek Church on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers decorating the simple wooden pews and sunlight streaming through the windows. Margaret stood as Ruby's matron of honor, the Barton children serving as attendants with varying degrees of solemnity. Robert was Flint's best man, little Joseph sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms throughout the ceremony. Ruby wore a dress of pale blue silk that Margaret had ordered from Denver, insisting it was her wedding gift and wouldn't take no for an answer. Her copper hair was arranged in soft curls, crowned with a wreath of spring blossoms. When she walked down the aisle on Robert's arm, he had insisted on giving her away, saying it was a father's privilege, and he was the closest thing she had. The church was full. Not just with the expected guests, the Bartons, Mrs. Hatcher, the ranch hands, but with townspeople Ruby had never expected to see. Mr. Peterson from the general store, the blacksmith and his family, even Mr. Thornton, standing at the back with a somewhat shamefaced expression. Flint waited for her at the altar, his face transforming with joy as she approached. In that moment, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that all the pain and struggle of her past had led her here, to this man, to this new beginning. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today." The words washed over Ruby like a blessing. When it came time for her vows, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying to the rafters. Not just a promise to Flint, but a declaration to herself and the world that she was worthy of this happiness, this love, this future. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister concluded. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Flint's kiss was tender but fervent, a sealed promise before all gathered. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, Ruby was stunned by the warm applause that greeted them. Not pity or condemnation, but genuine celebration. The reception was held at the Barton Ranch, the yard festooned with ribbons and more wildflowers. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by neighbors and friends. Children played tag around the adults, their laughter a counterpoint to the fiddle music provided by one of the ranch hands. "Mrs. Caldwell," Flint murmured in Ruby's ear as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "How does it sound?" "Perfect," Ruby replied, leaning into his embrace. "Absolutely perfect." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Mrs. Hatcher approached with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A wedding gift," she said, pressing it into Ruby's hands. "Not much, but I thought you might like it." Ruby unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. "For your new story," Mrs. Hatcher explained, patting Ruby's hand. "The one you're writing now with him." She nodded toward Flint, who was engaged in animated conversation with Robert across the yard. Every bride should record her happiness. Ruby embraced the older woman, overcome with gratitude for her unwavering support from the beginning. "Thank you for everything. You did the hard part yourself, dear." Mrs. Hatcher's eyes were misty. "You just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself." As the sun began to set, Flint sought out his bride, taking her hand and leading her to where their wagon waited, decorated with ribbons and flowers by the Barton children. "Ready to see our home?" he asked, his eyes shining with promise. Ruby looked back at the gathering, at Margaret cradling baby Joseph, at the twins chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk, at Mrs. Hatcher dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, and felt a fullness in her heart she'd never thought possible. "Yes," she said, turning back to her husband. "Take me home." Their new home was a simple 2-room cabin on the land Flint had purchased from Robert Barton. It wasn't much to look at yet, just the basics of shelter and comfort, but to Ruby, it was a palace. Their palace, built on mutual respect and genuine love. Flint carried her across the threshold, setting her down gently in what would be their main living area. A fire was already burning in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the sparse furnishings: a table and chairs, a small sofa, shelves waiting to be filled with the items that would make this house a home. "It's not much yet," Flint said, suddenly self-conscious, "but I'll add to it. A proper kitchen for you, more rooms when we need them." Ruby silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she whispered against his lips. "It's ours." That night, Flint loved her with exquisite tenderness, healing the wounds of her past with each gentle touch, each whispered endearment. In his arms, Ruby discovered what true intimacy meant: not the mechanical acts she'd been forced to perform at Madame Bouchard's, but a sacred communion of bodies and souls. "I love you," she told him in the quiet darkness afterward, her head pillowed on his chest. "I never thought I could feel this way." "This is just the beginning," Flint promised, pressing a kiss to her hair. "We have our whole lives ahead of us." In the years that followed, Ruby often thought back to that night, to the perfect rightness of Flint's words. It had indeed been just the beginning. Their small ranch prospered under their joint efforts. Flint had a natural gift with livestock, and Ruby proved herself adept at managing their household economy, even keeping the books with her neat, precise handwriting. They added a room to the cabin, then another, gradually transforming it into a proper home. 2 years after their marriage, Ruby gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, a perfect child with Flint's blue eyes and Ruby's copper hair. Watching Flint cradle their newborn with tears of joy streaming unashamedly down his face, Ruby felt the last shadows of her past finally dissolve in the pure light of their shared love. A son followed 2 years later, strong, healthy David with his father's build and his mother's determined spirit. Then another daughter, Grace, as delicate and lovely as her name. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought years tested their resources. A particularly harsh winter claimed some of their cattle. Flint broke his leg badly when a horse fell on him, leaving Ruby to manage everything while he healed. But they faced each difficulty together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. The town of Bitter Creek gradually changed too. New families arrived as the railroad expanded westward. The once scandalous story of Ruby's past faded into distant memory, replaced by her reputation as a devoted wife, loving mother, and respected neighbor. When fever swept through the community one autumn, it was Ruby who organized the women to care for the sick, drawing on skills learned in her darkest days to bring comfort to others. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Flint surprised Ruby with a gift: the deed to a small building on Bitter Creek's Main Street. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled by the official document. "Your bookshop," Flint explained, his eyes twinkling with pleasure at her surprise. "You've talked about it for years, how the town needs a proper place for books, how the children deserve stories and knowledge." Ruby stared at him in disbelief. "But the expense, we can afford it." Flint took her hands in his. "The ranch is doing well. The children are old enough to help more. And you, Ruby Caldwell, deserve to pursue your own dreams after giving so much to mine." Tears filled Ruby's eyes. "Our dreams," she corrected softly. "Everything we've built has been ours together. Then let this be our next chapter." Flint's smile was as warm and genuine as it had been the day they met. "Ruby's Books has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" The bookshop opened the following spring, a bright, welcoming space filled with volumes Ruby selected with loving care. She stocked practical manuals for ranchers alongside poetry collections, adventure tales for boys, and romance novels for young women dreaming of their own happy endings. A special section held children's books, with a small table and chairs where young visitors could sit and read. 3 afternoons a week, Ruby held story hour for the town's children. watching their eager faces as she read aloud from Treasure Island or Little Women. She sometimes caught herself marveling at how far she'd come from that frightened girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Bitter Creek all those years ago. On a warm summer evening 15 years after their wedding, Ruby sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching Flint teach their son the finer points of rope work in the yard. Hope, now a thoughtful young woman of 13, sat beside her mother mending a dress while 10-year-old Grace chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Mama," Hope asked suddenly, "how did you and Papa meet?" Ruby smiled, memories flooding back with crystalline clarity. "In town. At Peterson's general store. He was buying supplies and I was trading Mrs. Hatcher's biscuits for coffee." Was it love at first sight? Hope's romantic nature showed in her eager expression. Ruby considered the question carefully. Not exactly. But there was something special from the beginning. Your father really saw me when most people looked right through me. Because you were new in town. Partly that. Ruby chose her words with care. And partly because people had made up their minds about me without knowing the truth. Hope's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ruby glanced at her daughter, seeing the intelligence in her young face. One day, when Hope was older, Ruby would tell her the full story, not to burden her, but because truth, however difficult, was always better than secrets. For now, though, a simpler version would suffice. "Sometimes people judge others based on appearances or rumors, not facts," she explained. "They said unkind things about me, but your father didn't listen to gossip. He wanted to know me for himself." "What did he say when he heard the rumors?" Hope asked, always one for details. Ruby's gaze drifted to Flint, still patient and strong after all these years, laughing now as David successfully completed a difficult knot. "He said if they thought I was used goods, then he'd use his life to love me." "That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard," Hope declared, eyes wide. "It was," Ruby agreed softly, "and he's kept that promise every day since." As if sensing her thoughts, Flint looked up and caught Ruby's eye across the yard. His smile, the same one that had first warmed her heart in Peterson's store, still had the power to make her breath catch. He excused himself from David and crossed to the porch, dropping a casual kiss on Ruby's head before settling into the chair beside her. "What are my favorite ladies discussing so seriously?" he asked, reaching for Ruby's hand with the easy familiarity of long love. "Mama was telling me how you met," Hope explained. "And what you said about loving her." Flint's expression softened as he looked at Ruby. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet around them, Ruby and Flint sat together on the porch, watching stars appear one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him, their bodies fitting together with the perfect ease of long companionship. "Any regrets?" Flint asked softly, a question he posed on every anniversary, a tradition between them. "Not one," Ruby replied, as she always did, but this time she added. "Except perhaps that we didn't meet sooner." Flint's chuckle rumbled beneath her ear. "We met exactly when we were supposed to, not a moment too soon or too late." Ruby considered this, thinking of all the twists and turns of fate that had brought them together: her escape from Madame Bouchard's, Flint's decision to leave Texas, both of them ending up in tiny Bitter Creek at precisely the same time. "You believe in destiny?" she asked. "I believe in making choices," Flint replied thoughtfully. "And I believe some souls are meant to find each other, no matter what obstacles stand in their way." Ruby smiled in the darkness. "Then I'm glad my soul found yours." "As am I." Flint pressed a kiss to her temple, right over the faded scar that was now barely visible, a reminder not of pain but of survival. "Every single day." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of their ranch cattle lowing softly in the distance, the creak of the windmill, an owl calling from the old cottonwood near the creek. Sounds of home, of peace, of a life well lived and fully shared. Ruby thought of the journal Mrs. Hatcher had given her on her wedding day, now filled with 15 years of memories, births and celebrations, struggles and triumphs, moments ordinary and extraordinary. The story of a woman who had survived the worst of humanity only to discover its best in the love of a good man and the family they had created together. "I love you, Flint Caldwell," she said softly. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Flint's arms tightened around her. "I love you, Ruby Caldwell. Thank you for giving me the greatest gift a man could ask for a life worth living, with a woman worth loving." Under the vast canopy of stars in the home they'd built together, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true worth not in others' judgment, but in the unconditional love she'd both received and given. The girl who had once been called used goods had become a woman of immeasurable value, not despite her past, but because of how she had risen above it. And Flint, true to his word, had used his life to love her completely, faithfully, without reservation. It was a promise kept, a vow honored, a love story written not in grand gestures but in the quiet, steadfast devotion of everyday life shared. In the end, that was the greatest redemption of all.